Good evening. I'm Alex Halliday. I am Director of Columbia University's Earth Institute. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. Columbia is a great place to be right now for discussions around climate and sustainability and the future of the planet. And we're building a climate school as part of that initiative. Tonight, we're going to look at the costs, the stakes, and the realities around the push to decarbonize our planet. Leaders around the world have set goals to dramatically cut carbon emissions in order to try and achieve net zero. The stakes are exceedingly high. Research tells us the next decade will be crucial for taking powerful action to address climate change and stem the catastrophic climate impacts associated with 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade rise in global climate, let alone what might happen if we go beyond that. But how do we get there? What kinds of actions need to happen now? How will society need to change? Who will be the short and long-term winners and losers, and what do we do about that? So with me tonight, we have two of Columbia University's thought leaders in this area of energy, policy, and sustainability. Laurie Fitzmaurice is Executive Director at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. And Peter Kelemen is Research Scientist at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and the Arthur D. Stork Memorial Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences. So if you both like to switch your cameras on, your light and your, that's great. Good, wonderful. So Laurie has extensive experience specializing in energy infrastructure development around the world and has deep knowledge of international energy markets, most recently having managed the commercial development of wind and solar power projects in Mexico and Chile. Peter studies the chemical and physical processes of reaction between fluids and rocks. His primary focus now is on CO2 removal from air and permanent storage via carbon mineralization, a natural process that he'll tell us about as the evening goes on. So welcome to both of you. Great to have you here. And it's brilliant to have such expertise here at Columbia able to discuss these difficult topics. So I'd like to kick off with you, Laurie, and just by way of introduction, tell us a bit about yourself. You grew up in Southern California. Were there early influences close to home that led you to this work in particular?
Strangely enough, no. Actually, I grew up in San Diego, and my parents were both attorneys. And the only thing I knew growing up was that I did not want to go to law school. And so I actually went to college in Pennsylvania at Swarthmore and studied cultural anthropology and was convinced that I wanted to be an academic, and went to South America to after graduation to spend some time while I decided whether to pursue anthropology or literature, and ended up falling into a job for a NASDAQ listed renewable energy company. And this was in the early 90s. And it's been, almost 30 years, and I continued. And here we are. Okay,
and Peter, how about you? You've been a lead architect of a particular area of decarbonization technology, but you didn't start there. So what led you to geological research in the first place?
Well, it's interesting, like Laurie, I was in college and I realized that I didn't want to go to law school. I mean, no offense, I'm sure there's many lawyers listening to this, but I didn't want to do it. And I was just basically averse to the competition. And I didn't want to go to medical school, and I didn't want to go to business school. I didn't want to be a journalist. And I was at a liberal arts college at Dartmouth, where almost no department actually prepares you for a job. And so the only department that looked like they could prepare me to work after I finished my degree was geology. So I switched my major. And I was majoring in English and philosophy. All I wanted to do was go climbing and read books. But so at that time, all the geology majors at Dartmouth were getting summer jobs in mineral exploration. And so I thought I would work seasonally. That would be my day job. And then I would, think great thoughts the rest of the year.
Well, the legal affairs of the United States have gone downhill as a result of this, but great loss to our country. Anyway, so let's turn to the issue of net zero and what does it mean? So maybe we could kick off with Laurie, your perspective on what the term net zero actually refers to.
Sure. And this is something, Peter and I had some great conversations in preparing for this. I think it's really important that we explain net zero, a term that has become, that has been tossed around a lot lately, and you'll see it in the press. And I think it's really important to explain it in terms that everyone can understand. Net zero emissions refer to really a balance between what we produce in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and what we remove in terms of those same emissions. And net zero is basically the point at which we stop making the situation worse by emitting more than what we're drying down, than what we're removing, really. And Peter and I identified a very well-known graph in the industry that I just wanted to put up real quick and maybe share with everyone. I promise we will not overwhelm you with more than just this one slide. And the reason I wanted to share this is that it shows in a really obvious way. Here you see the point of what net zero is. And what's so important is really this point. There we go. Did I lose it? Sorry about that. This point here, all this section you see in blue of mitigated greenhouse gas emissions, this top point being business as usual if we don't change any of our behavior whatsoever through time. This whole section in blue, we would have to completely convert all of our energy systems, our industrial productions, cement, steel, all of our vehicles and trucks would have to become electric. We would have to change the way everything would have to become renewable, a number of things that are incredibly difficult to do. And that would only get us down to here. That wouldn't even get us to net zero. And I just want to really make it clear to everyone how difficult this is. And Peter, I would ask you to also jump in here. I think it's important that we put this in terms people can understand.
Okay.
Well, okay, so I'll speak up while you've got the slide up. So this sort of brown region that's labeled other greenhouse gases, other GHG, that's things like cow burps and other agricultural emissions that are really pretty difficult to mitigate without huge changes in lifestyle that can't be mandated. And then the little CO2 bit at the bottom there, that's for very expensive things that are hard to decarbonize, like airplanes. So that nobody's really envisioning electric airplanes. And as a result, because there are still those recalcitrant emissions that we can't easily prevent, the light blue area underneath the zero curve there, in order to get net zero, you have to take CO2 out of the air. And that's what's known as negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal from air.
And I'll pull this down now so we can continue our conversation, but thank you for indulging us by allowing us to show you one of our favorite slides.
Yeah, it looks nicer than the original. So,
Well, maybe we could say where the original came from. It's based on some IPCC reports in the middle of the previous decade, and then there was a United Nations report that published that particular figure for the first time. But it's important to say that these are reasonably conservative organizations. They're not on a soapbox, and they started out very skeptical about negative emissions because they want people to go ahead and do all the other things that need to be done. So the fact that they came to the conclusion that this is necessary is pretty important.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of global thinking, President Biden took office in January. He rejoined the United States into the Paris Climate Accord and set a goal of making the US carbon neutral by 2050, a move that will require steeper emission cuts than America has ever achieved. How ambitious is this, and how realistic is it? Mike, I know it's ambitious, but how realistic is it, Peter?
Well, it's very ambitious, of course, but it can be done. And what a lot of us might say is that it has to be done. And so the amount of expenditure, first of all, will employ people and so on, but the amount of expenditure that's involved is very large. It's on the order of what we spend for sewage treatment and to take out the garbage, municipal waste management. And then but we don't treat it that way because we just put CO2 in the air for free. But there's a significant chance that this is an existential threat for people. That if we let the greenhouse gas problem go on unchecked, or if we don't attain net zero, then it's going to become an uninhabitable place for us. And so once we get that through our heads, then obviously we need to do whatever it takes. And whatever it takes is comparable to things we already do. So it's possible, of course.
Okay. So what is imagine we're in 2050. What does the power system in the United States look like? What does energy look like? Laurie, do you want to tell us a bit about this?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll start with the general comment that the power system in the United States in 2050 looks very different from what it does today. I'll give you a hint. It's not 100% renewable. We can't just go with all solar and all wind to solve this problem. If we really propose to achieve net zero, to truly combat climate change and its effects, we need to build out a power system in the United States that takes into consideration the best of renewable technology, solves our issues around long-haul transmission, which we have not yet solved, has some form of new generation nuclear power, I firmly believe, incorporates battery storage where appropriate, and I'd invite Peter to comment on battery storage a bit more, has regulation that respects issues of equity and health, and does all of that while taking into consideration the end consumer and what the end consumer can actually pay. And there are tremendous challenges around that, as we've seen recently. I would just add the comment too, takes into consideration our changing climate. We can chat about Texas if we want to, but I think that's a relevant point, as we've seen in recent weeks.
Yeah, so I mean, Texas is a good example where they've got fantastic wind power, and of course they blame the collapse of the grid on what happened. Do you want to take us through that a bit more and explain to us? I mean, the Wall Street Journal said the Texas grid failure is the risk of banning fossil fuels. Is that really true?
I don't believe so, no. If you look at the Texas grid, there's a number of different things. One, you have to understand that the Texas grid is 80 to 85% isolated from other grids in the United States. We have several different power systems in the US, and the majority of the Texas grid, which is ERCOT, or referred to as ERCOT, is isolated from other systems. Therefore, they don't have the redundancy or the backup of being linked to other power systems. So they couldn't pull in from other systems to. So
that's completely weird and unique, isn't it, in America? That
Texas... It is, and what it means is that for the majority of regulatory issues, the Texas grid is not subject to oversight of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is very important to Texas. And there's another critical thing to note about Texas, that Texas has made a choice after the storm of 2011 not to winterize their infrastructure. And that's a choice you can make. We all make those choices with regard to any investment in any infrastructure. When you build your house, when you purchase, any type of infrastructure, you're making choices. Well, Texas made a choice. You can winterize any infrastructure, such as a number of the water pumps that failed on some of their natural gas combined cycle plants, or some of the very simple pieces of equipment that failed at their nuclear plant, or the blades on their wind turbines. And it's easy to say in hindsight that that was a mistake, but when you make a plan like that, you say, am I going to invest against a 100-year storm or a 50-year storm? And so those were the choices that were made when those capital investments were decided for each individual facility. And so today we're sitting here and saying they should have done that, but when those investments were made, I'm sure they really believed that the odds of that happening were incredibly low. Insurance policies were taken out, individual financings were done for all of those facilities. And people made what they thought were responsible decisions. Well, now, as we take into consideration the changing climate, I think a lot of those things need to be reconsidered. I would also say that a lot of the rhetoric that came out and occurred during and after that event, I think was was largely responding to political expediency and not to what actually happened on the ground. If you look at what occurred generating unit by generating unit, what happened there had very little to do with renewables. The renewables largely stayed running. What failed first, unit by unit, natural gas was down and the nuclear facility was down. And you can look at it, and we actually at the Center on Global Energy Policy plotted it out generating by unit by generating unit. They were less than 6 minutes away from a total grid failure. And they were smart to take down the units they did in order to avoid a total grid failure that would have made it extremely difficult to bring that system back up.
Okay, that's great. So a question for either or both of you. We often hear, and this relates to what you were saying earlier, Laurie, that the CO2 problem, the answer to the CO2 problem is to go 100% renewable. And you said that's actually not going to work. But what does it mean exactly to be 100%? Does it mean 100% solar and wind energy? Is that realistic, or what are your thoughts on that?
Since Laurie kind of queued me up, I'll jump in here. It's certainly the case that both solar and wind power are intermittent, right? The sun doesn't shine all the time, and even more fundamentally, there are big seasonal changes in the amount of sunlight that places get, especially at high latitudes, and so it's a big issue. A lot of people say, well, we need so-called baseload power from gas or nuclear. And I'm not in principle against that, but I remain a child of the 60s and 70s, and I haven't quite seen yet what we're going to do with the nuclear waste and how we're going to deal with proliferation risk. So I'm kind of cautious about that still. But anyway, as an alternative or in addition, I'm getting really interested in chemical storage of energy. When we talk about batteries, we usually think of a big hunk of lead and acid like what sits in the car. But there's lots of ways to store energy that are maybe a little less obvious. For example, you can use solar electricity to split water and make hydrogen and oxygen. Or you can go one step further and take hydrogen and combine it with CO2 from air and make natural gas. And I don't know, right now, the buzz in Europe is hydrogen, but I kind of like the natural gas idea. We already have all the transportation infrastructure for gas in the form of pipelines, but also LNG tankers and gas-fired power plants, and lots of homes sitting on pipelines that use gas to heat. So if we had green gas, if we had gas made from air, for example, I think that would be good. And it can store energy for days, weeks, months, years if you need it to. So I don't think that chemical batteries, solid state batteries, will ever beat that for the weekly to annual scale of storage. And if I were in a place that gets lots of sunlight but doesn't have a lot of customers, and I wanted to generate lots of solar electricity and then export it and sell it, I would really think about doing it that way. So the Saudis, for example, but also, in West Texas.
Okay. Laurie, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I will just add on some comments to what Peter has said. I think his point is a very interesting one, and we're seeing a lot of different countries looking at essentially how to export renewable energy in different forms. If you look at Chile's program on green hydrogen, what they're looking at doing as a country that does not have any indigenous sources of energy, they're trying to determine how to take the northern Atacama Desert, put solar facilities there, and use it to create green hydrogen to export, which is really the same concept, sort of as what Peter was describing, just with some different forms. And they're targeting export markets in Asia, really to supply from northern Chile. And they think that they can do that. And all of this is, if you take a look at the Chilean Ministry of Energy's website, they have some pretty interesting pitches on this in numbers, and we've spent time talking to them about it. And it's very interesting to see as countries think about how to decarbonize, how they rate their relative resources or lack thereof, and are getting more creative in trying to find ways to solve this. But my basic point is, in the same way, we should look at our resources. And as Peter said, we have all this infrastructure. How do we use the infrastructure we have creatively? And we do have an awful lot of pipe that was put down for natural gas, both long haul pipes and distribution, that I think we need to consider. In my point about it's not going to be 100% renewable, and I say this having worked for decades in renewables, has to do with the fact of the intermittency that Peter mentioned. And because of the intermittency, we need some kind of baseload backup. And I think we're going to see a combination of certain kinds of batteries. I think we need, and the reason I mentioned nuclear is because I do think that there's going to be a role for nuclear of the small modular variety, sort of new generation, to create that baseload power in the system. And there's a lot to be worked out on that, how to deal with nuclear waste. That's something that this country needs to solve regardless. And so I think that, but my perspective is 100% renewable might sound really good in a headline, but it does not meet the user's needs in the way that we consume electricity today.
Okay, that's great. Peter, can I turn to you and talk to you about your particular area of expertise, mineral carbonation? Can you explain it in very simple terms, recognizing that not everybody is a geochemist here? What are you seeking to accomplish, and also how do you inform energy policy as we head towards net zero?
Well, let's take the first bit. What I'm mainly focused on right now, and I'm really pretty excited about, is actually very easy to explain. In fact, it's so kind of simple and dumb that it's sort of embarrassing to explain. So, but anyway, bear with me. So you take limestone and heat it up. And limestone is made of the mineral calcite, calcium carbonate. So if you heat it up, you release CO2, which you then store or use for something, and calcium oxide. Then you can take that, which is known as lime. You know, many of you put it on your gardens. You take the calcium oxide and you put it out in the weather, and it draws down CO2 from air spontaneously and makes limestone again. And then you just take that and heat it up and do the same thing over and over again. So it's so simple, it's almost stupid. But because you're using the calcium oxide over and over again, you remove a giant amount of CO2 per kilogram of limestone that you start with. We're finding that we can convert 75% of calcium oxide to calcite, to calcium carbonate, in less than 2 weeks in the lab, just by reacting it with air. And so because this process is so simple, it currently has the lowest peer-reviewed cost estimate of any method for direct air capture that's been proposed. And as a consequence, there's a lot of interest in this Columbia-based patent applications and interest in commercializing this technology. So we can talk more about this during the discussion if people are interested.
Sure. So, I mean, just to follow on from that, though, do you believe carbon capture and storage technology is at a point where it can be a meaningful part of the decarbonization solution?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course we can do it if we want to. I would say there's about half. Remember the graph that Laurie had up, the light blue negative emissions part at the bottom. We think about half of that might be achievable by changing agricultural practices. And then you're left with the other half, which to quantify that, that's 5 billion tons a year by 2055, the half. And so we can do it, but let's look and see how much will that cost. So Goldman Sachs says that avoiding the last 10 to 20% of emissions, so that's 5 to 10 billion tons of human emissions per year, would maybe cost more than $200 per ton of CO2. Why? Well, it's hydrogen airplanes or electric airplanes and all sorts of kind of science fiction-y stuff. So 5 billion times $200 per ton is $1 trillion, or about 1% of current global GDP. So if we remove CO2 from air at $100 a ton, that's a bargain. We save half of that. In order, if we need to do that in order to limit greenhouse warming to less than 2 degrees C, then of course we can go ahead and do it. What does 10 billion tons of negative emissions really mean? That's hard to get your head around. So to put that in perspective, BP reports that the oil and gas industry in 2019 or 2019 produced 4.5 billion tons of oil and gas. So when we're talking about 10 billion tons of negative emissions by 2055, that's twice the size of the current transportation and refining infrastructure today. So it's big.
Of the world.
Yes. So it's big, but again, it's a few percent of GDP. It's the kind of money we spend on all kinds of other waste management.
Okay. So how do we get, I mean, it's great to hear about these brilliant ideas about limestone or direct air capture with artificial trees or whatever. How do we get to this kind of scale that you're talking about? This is such a vast amount of CO2 that needs to be removed. What apart from the cost, how does it work?
The government is starting, the Department of Energy has had several calls for proposal just this year for technology, direct air capture technology. And there's philanthropic support that's starting to emerge, direct grants for research. And then we need to get not just we need to get out of the lab and off the bench and up to the level of pilot projects. Let's say a pilot project might remove 100,000 tons or 1 million tons of CO2 from air per year. Those are expensive projects. We think a pilot project using our technology to remove 100,000 tons of CO2 from the air would cost on the order of $50 million. So where exactly is that investment going to come from? I'm not quite sure. Right now, there's a market for CO2. You can sell CO2 to greenhouses, beverage companies, pharmaceutical companies, even oil companies. And that market provides a potential profit that our investors are interested in. But if we want to scale up from the 100 million tons that market currently sustains to 10 billion tons by 2055, that's the hard lift. That's the political piece. There's no question about it. You know, again, I just can't say this often enough. We pay this kind of money to treat sewage and process solid waste. But why? Taxpayers pay governments who then contract out services. And that's politics. That's not science. We need some kind of tax or something that's equivalent to the way that we pay for other kinds of waste disposal.
Right. Okay, so that takes us a little bit to the field of policy. So Laurie, let's bring you in here. So where do you see carbon capture and storage fitting into the future energy grid?
Well, in the simplest terms on the grid side, you can see it as a point source on fossil fuel power plants in the very short term. I think that's an easy way to imagine it. And then I think you can take, and that's sort of a temporary bridge in a way. And because one of the challenges I think that we have to take into consideration is that there's a lot of countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels that are burning coal Mexico burns coal, India burns coal, China is burning, what is it, Peter, you and I were talking about 58% of their total energy comes from burning coal.
Yeah, and there was a big article about that in the New York Times today, about how difficult it's going to be to persuade local governments and industry to give up coal.
Yeah, and it's because we often talk about the power system as though it existed in isolation, and it doesn't. And I think India and China are great examples. And I worked several years in Mexico, and I would go to the region where coal was from. Those are livelihoods. And we talk about livelihoods, those are people, those are jobs, those are families. And, you know, India, 60% of their generation matrix is based on coal. And those are millions of jobs, entire regions where coal is mined, where it is processed, where it is shipped by rail. And all of those livelihoods, jobs, families, people, that's not easy. We're talking about transforming economies. We're talking about policies. We're talking about, you know, having entire economies and governments that need to dialogue and think about how to do that kind of transformation. Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to think about carbon capture as assisting in that transformation, because, you know, as opposed to having those power plants continue to operate as they are, carbon capture could assist in the continued operation of those plants in a less polluting way.
I see. Okay. So where does nuclear power fit into all of this? I mean, you were mentioning, I mean, you may have different views, the two of you, on desirability of it. Why are you so keen on nuclear though, Laurie?
When I look at the needs of a power system, and I look at our options, and I go back to the slide we showed earlier, and I think about truly where I want the grid of the future to be, I see smaller scale nuclear reactors as a tool with issues and complexities, but as a tool that can be used to provide that baseload power. So maybe it's 10% of the overall grid, but it is, for me, a feasible tool to be deployed in a thoughtful way, in a careful way, but it is a feasible tool.
Okay, so let's get to this, the whole issue of this transformation that we're talking about. It's going to be needed, which, I mean, Laurie, you described it beautifully. It's just going to be a radical change in the way we do things around the world, including in the United States. The economy is predicated on the oil and gas industry. According to American Petroleum Institute, 2.8 million Americans work in the oil and gas industry. So what's going to happen to these people? What's going to happen to these communities? What's going to happen to their economies during this kind of transition? Is anybody really thinking about this?
Well, of course, people are thinking about it, and we're reading about it. And as politicians, the current ruling politicians, like to emphasize, many people, particularly skilled engineers who build and maintain infrastructure, can easily transition from oil and gas to renewables, or let's say to making fuel from hydrogen and CO2 from air, you know. But I don't think there will be as many jobs in renewable energy and clean tech as there are in oil and gas, and particularly coal. And so I don't know if the scholarship has been done. Laurie and I were talking about we should figure out the ratio of jobs per kilowatt for different energy sources. But you know, we really have to face this, and this isn't specific to the energy transition. We don't really know where a lot of jobs will go as we go to robotic cars and electric trucks and online retail and all these kinds of things. It's a big problem, but it's not exclusive to oil and gas workers. And it almost feels as though in the second half of this century, you know, I'll be dead, but the younger people listening to this will really kind of have to rethink how they want to spend their time. That said, I just want to this isn't something we discussed before, but we can look at all of these things and sort of try and remove some of the moral and ethical labels we've put on stuff. If we wanted to continue using gas and we captured all the CO2 that was ever produced by burning gas, and we kept all the leaks from all the gas wells, it would be a carbon neutral fuel like nuclear power, and we would not have to transform quite so much of the energy infrastructure. So if you look at, for example, the Goldman Sachs report, and you just look at dollars and cents, how much does this process cost to eliminate 5 billion tons of CO2 per year emissions? And how do we compare that to this other process? All these things are complicated, as Laurie said. Nukes have their upsides, they have their downsides. Well, we really need to come up with a way to put all those things on a level playing field and compare them, because we don't want to blow up something and choose a more expensive alternative.
Laurie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think it's the way I think about it too is I think we have to look at it globally and think about it in terms of issues also of equality and equity, as we'd like to talk a lot about, and there are subtle differences between the two. I think we're going to ultimately end up with a global climate budget, so to speak. We know what the numbers are, and we know essentially how much we can burn in terms of fossil fuels. The question is, how do you allocate that? And if we try to take the politics out of it and the emotion out of it for a moment, there's also a very real dynamic in which there are a lot of countries that are currently consuming, you know, 1/5, less than, 1/10 of what more mature economies consume in terms of power every day. And those countries are not going to take kindly to, the United States or Western Europe telling them that, because of the existential threat of climate change, you need to stop burning natural gas, when the strongest company in your entire economy, or the driver of your GDP happens to be a state-owned oil and gas company. It's unrealistic, I think, to expect that. And so if we look at the global climate budget, as I call it, how do we want to allocate that? How should that be allocated during this transition period? And it is perfectly understandable that those countries aspire to improve the quality of life of their citizens and to improve the GDP. And there are countries, where their issues are clean cooking, where women and girls are the ones who are burning, dung and burning, woody biomass for cooking, and where girls are walking 6 or 8 hours a day to collect that. And so there are different issues in different countries. And I think it's important to look at the challenge of this great transformation as a challenge that we are up to. We are up to this challenge. We have the skills and the intelligence, and I would say the capacity to imagine what this new situation and this transformed world can look like. And what we need to do is bring together constituencies that have historically spent more time arguing than creating. And I think the role of the university can be pivotal in that regard.
Okay, so this has been very helpful. We're going to turn to the audience for questions pretty soon, but before we do that, I always like to ask my guests to consider just one takeaway message they would like to leave the audience about this issue. Given what's before us, which is a changing climate, which, as we know, is going to be dire unless we do something, all this disruption we're talking about in terms of changing the energy balance, it's a big issue. What's the big issue you really want to leave people with right now in terms of what they should take away from your comments tonight?
Yeah, so I think we can all agree that maintaining a sustainable climate for humans is not optional. And so, of course, there's a considerable amount of uncertainty about what exactly is needed to accomplish that. But I think we can mostly all agree that it is under threat. And we know that the scale of the problem is gigantic. So one thing to take from that is no action that we take right now to begin to address that problem will be wasted. No dollar spent on trying to address decarbonizing the energy system will be wasted in 2020. We don't know exactly how the future looks, but taking the first steps is a no-brainer. I can go through the cost calculations again, but I think I've said this several times. So, but let's ask the more, I just read Betsy Colbert's book, Under a White Sky. It's daunting. The size of the problem, the white sky. Well, maybe I shouldn't spoiler alert. Okay. But changing the color of the sky in order to address the climate problem is just science fiction. And so sometimes you look at that and you just say, I can't believe that. I can't believe that could happen. But on the other hand, the scale of this is, we can view it. We should turn that picture inside out, flip that cube inside out. It's intimidating, we could fail, but it's inspiring, and it's frightening in a way that should make us get energized. So everybody should think about how to get involved and start making these changes, because the direction we have to go is clear. It's not exactly clear where we're going to end up, but the places to start are obvious.
Thanks, Peter. What about you, Laurie? What would be your takeaway message?
Peter reminded me, and I'll share an image. I lived a number of years in Santiago, Chile. And for those of you who have been there, and for those of you who have not, Santiago is at the base of the Andes Mountain. And Santiago has, for all of the years I've been going in the last 28, 30 years, had a tremendous problem with air pollution being trapped in the valley. And in winter, you can't see the Andes from the city. And when you were talking about the sky, Peter, that's what I thought of. Imagine not being able to see a mountain range like that. When you talk about, Peter, what we should all think about and the difference, this is a very intimidating dynamic and reality that we're talking about. I think it's important to acknowledge that reality and to find a way to be energized by it. And I liked your use of that word, Peter. I think that it's in that way we need to recognize the interconnected nature of ourselves, our communities. I talk a lot about, this global climate budget in different countries. The reality is that we are all part of, I think about the world's energy system because that's the area where I work, but we are all part of that energy system. It is inherently linked to climate. Decarbonization will require, the decarbonization of the energy system that, as you know, Alex, because we discuss it quite frequently, contributes, the energy system, 70% of emissions are from the energy system. We're all participants in that energy system every day, even when you don't think about it. We live in communities that vote on initiatives with regard to how our infrastructure is built, how energy infrastructure is built. We consume heat, light, electricity in our everyday lives. Think about what the true cost of those things are in your everyday life. Do you know what those costs are? Do you know what is in that bill that you pay? Do you know what those initiatives that you vote on that affect those things? I would urge you to think about that a little bit more, to take a little extra time to know more about those things in your everyday life, because they have an impact on everything we've discussed today. And I think that as we become more educated consumers of the energy system and more aware of the issues of climate, we can influence them politically as well. And I think that's tremendously important.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, both of you. Okay, so let's turn to the audience now. So there's a ton of questions coming in, and I have to say, I apologize, we're not going to be able to get anywhere near all of these questions. So, but we'll go through a few of them and see how we get on. And maybe we can, if you can make your questions short and succinct and ask a question rather than making a point. And if Peter and Laurie, if you could make the answers quite brief as well, that'd be great. So there is a recent Princeton study that I think we're all familiar with, which suggests that a switch away from fossil fuels to wind and solar would require 10% of the land area of the United States. How does such a finding affect how we decarbonize? Can we afford to dedicate so much land to this effort? That Princeton study, of course, involved a number of different kinds of players and interests, so it may not be the only story and the only version of the story, but it'd be interesting to hear what you thought, either of you.
I'll give a quick answer, and then Peter, you can give one. There are assumptions there as to the technology, the tremendous strides that solar and wind technology have made in the last 10 to 15 years. I think you'd have to look at those assumptions, and it really just brings up the question of land use. And I think while that's an interesting question, it doesn't address the intermittency issue for me, which continues to be the most important aspect of looking at what the power grid needs to be in order to maintain the type of service that the end consumer demands.
Yeah. Peter?
Well, I'd say that the 10% land area estimate is on the high side. And but if the question is, can we afford to devote 5% of the land area in the United States to energy generation? The answer surely again is yes. And keep in mind that to a certain extent, we don't have a lot of choices.
Right.
The other point I want to make at some point, and I'll bring it up now, we're sort of in the energy aristocracy in the United States, but global per capita energy consumption of 2,500 watts per person is the level of energy consumption in the Eastern United States that Europeans had in 1750. So that's the average. The median is actually lower than that. And so think about what is that? That's sort of an amazing fact. And when I first heard it, I didn't believe it. So I did the calculation myself. But think about what that means. It means that more than half the people in the world are below that level. And when they get there, which we all hope they will, they're not going to want to stop there. The level where European people in the Eastern United States were in 1750 with no hospitals and no trains. They're going to want to continue to improve. Yeah. So people sort of think that if we can just get the Americans and maybe the richer Europeans to conserve energy, everything's going to be okay. That is not true. And in order to address the legitimate energy aspirations of most of the people on the planet, we have to probably at least triple and maybe quintuple global energy consumption while we solve this greenhouse gas problem. So it's not a question of how we feel about it. At a certain point, it's just kind of what we have to do. And we have to look at that with a cold cost-benefit perspective.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so there's a question here about geological sequestration. So, so how is this really going to work? People are trying to grapple with the idea we're going to put all the CO2 underground or wherever. Will it be local? Will it be close to source? Is this going to work in a particular kind of way? Are we going to have to take the stuff a long way and then dump it in some way, or pump it underground remotely?
Well, so you would build power plants that are going to emit, let's say biofuel power plants, which are net negative. You would build them near places where you can store CO2. Because of course you don't want to add transportation costs. Air capture, CO2 removal from air, of course it couldn't be anywhere. The air is well mixed. We measure the global number that everybody knows of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is measured from the top of a volcano in Hawaii. So you can take CO2 out of the air anywhere. And again, you would site those places near storage sites. The global storage capacity is giant. We don't have to worry about that.
Okay. Can I ask about how the grid, I mean, again, imagining the grid in 2050, what do you think about community-based solar battery microgrids? And I can imagine why certain countries of the world, this may be actually the brilliant solution. They actually haven't got much of a grid right now, and you can provide them with something on a solar microgrid basis that could work very effectively. But that's sort of against, large-scale regional transmission type organizations. Have you got any thoughts about that, Laurie, about which is going to be the way of the future?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you're describing is distributed generation. And whether it's solar in a battery or something else in a battery, a small scale wind turbine, I mean, this technology exists today. It's very expensive. So the question is expensive relative to what? And expensive, and how is the technology going to change over time? And so currently it's considered expensive in industry terms relative to the fossil fuel alternative. And that is a judgment that is made in industry terms, mostly by distribution utilities, and who have the responsibility to provide that service. So what I have seen in my career, and the first project like that I worked on was in Patagonia on the Argentine side in the late mid 90s. I think would have been mid 90s, 1994. I went all over Patagonia looking at projects that were small diesel generators, batteries, and wind turbines. And the idea was to optimize the use of the diesel generator, store and use the wind turbine when there was wind, of which there's a lot in Patagonia. So I think the industry has been trying to optimize for this for a long time, because utilities, they have the obligation to serve in a lot of these remote places, are trying to do it in the most cost-effective way. They weren't worried about climate then. We are now. Peter?
I have a naive and happy idea, and I'm out of my specialization. So I hope you don't, blow up my beautiful theory with an ugly fact. But in Oman and India, places where I've worked a lot, we watched people jump right over telephone lines. They never had to install phone lines. So that there were villages where we did watch the electric wires go in, but they didn't have phones, and then they got cell phones. So they never had to build all that infrastructure.
Exactly.
I think that is happening in village life. Again, we don't usually think about the people below the average energy consumption curve, but I think in India, there's lots of villages where they get a few solar panels and some batteries together and run a little retail business, recharging stuff for people. So I can imagine that at the rural level, we really might just jump right over the power lines and go directly to local solar. And the expense per person isn't that high. So yeah, if the net cost of electricity somehow goes up, the customer won't even really notice that.
That is absolutely happening. I've seen it all over Latin America. The question is, can you add the battery component in a way that is cost effective? Because the solar is already being deployed that way. It's the battery component that would be the game changer.
I'll just break in. So the cheapest way, the best way, the most efficient way to store energy is to pump water uphill.
Yeah.
So in Chile, they have hills.
Yes, and Chile has some large solar and pump storage projects.
And they've also got lithium, so they can do batteries as well. Place to go, I can tell you.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, so actually that brings us on to another subject, which because Laurie, you talked about nuclear, and one of the questions is about could you actually say a bit more about this in terms of why we have to have nuclear? Why is this such an important part of it? I've heard this from quite a few people think this, and I hear other people saying, well, actually, if you just build more capacity in terms of renewables, vastly bigger and more extensive wind farms, you can actually generate enough winds and power and to actually make this happen. There's some countries saying this without going to nuclear, you'll actually have enough renewable capacity. And then of course there's batteries. And of course, we never thought solar would take off the way it did, or wind. And now batteries could be going the same path. We can actually generate much more effective and large scale storage devices. So why do we need nuclear? Why is it so critical?
Yeah, I mean, this is lots of different opinions on this. It depends on your view on the battery side and will batteries ultimately be able to do at what cost? And on the wind side, depending on the country's wind regime, if different countries think they can get there with all wind, and I've worked in wind a long time, it also, I think with onshore wind, it's very unlikely. You would need an awful lot of offshore wind plus onshore wind and solar, plus a lot of batteries. And I'd have to look at the actual numbers. I think it's more realistic to try to get there with some nuclear in that mix. That's my opinion based on what I've seen.
So we're a bit behind the curve on nuclear. I mean, China is building every kind of nuclear reactor you can and trying them all out and seeing which ones work best and saying, oh, we'll do those. Whereas we seem to have not really advanced much, even though we're so amazing in the United States at nuclear weapons research. The whole side of reactor development doesn't seem to, stayed afloat much. Nuclear engineering seems to have disappeared.
Exactly.
The US still has more nuclear power plants than any other country.
Yeah,
in terms of what we're operating, but they're certainly the older ones.
Yeah,
they're older
You're
ones.
correct. Yeah.
So the small modular reactors might be a good way to go, given that we've got submarine fleets with small modular reactors effectively. Maybe we can.
One quick note, Alex, it's been a couple of years, so I have to update this, but despite the fact that the Chinese are building nuclear power plants as fast as you might think was possible, the share of nuclear power generation in China hasn't changed in 20 years.
Right. Well, that's because they're increasing the amount of coal.
They can't keep up.
Yeah.
No, that's true. Okay, one more quick question, and then we should probably wrap this up. What do you see as the energy mix of the future in the United States and globally? How much of that may be new technologies? And then how do politicians create policy to facilitate this transition? And I think that's a particularly tricky issue. So maybe deal with the first thing first, the energy mix that you see going forward in the United States and globally. And I guess maybe there isn't such a thing as quite hard to figure out the global thing, because actually energy is going to be a very regional thing in terms of how you sort it out. But have you got any comments on this? And then we should talk about how do you create policy.
As for the mix, I'm going to let Laurie.
Well, I think there's an interesting, I mean, I've shared my views on where I think it would be in 2050. I think that there's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue. I think we need policy that will massively fund R&D to spur innovation. And I think that's where we could see some new technologies come from, in addition to those that are already identified. And for those that are already identified, I think we know we need to, in terms of what vectors we need to push to continue down the path in batteries. There's a lot of effort there already. And I think but we need to see more, because right now what's cost effective is a 4-hour or a 6-hour battery plus solar somewhere. That's not going to give us what we need. In terms of what's commercial today. And we have a long way to go to make batteries plus renewable commercially viable. I think we're going to see a lot more offshore wind in the next 10 to 15 years. I think the US needs to catch up on small scale nuclear. I've already mentioned that. But I think what we need to see is massive spending on R&D and innovation in the energy space.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, even in the, it does strike me that, I mean, it strikes me it's more than R&D though. I mean, we need policy around how we're going to actually, how we're going to share energy, I guess, and how we're going to move things around and all the rest of it. But on the R&D, in the R&D space, it strikes me that quite remarkable, given that we've known about this problem of climate change for so long. We've known we've got to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Why hasn't there been a vast amount of money invested by the US government in federal dollars going into negative emissions technologies? It seems to be something that's been small scale compared with the scale of the problem. I don't quite understand that. I don't know where that, Peter, maybe you've got
Well, I don't want to point fingers, but I kind of will a little bit. So the expectation in the United States is that a lot of that funding comes to the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy is, to some extent, pretty strongly controlled by two-year cycle politics, and also likes to be top down and pick winners. And so the perception was, widely shared by various professors I could name, that until we capture CO2 from every single point source, it's too expensive to bother with taking CO2 out of the air. And because of the way DOE works, once that opinion gets circulated among the top, then it goes down. And so that's it. It's not right. Because why isn't it right? Because we can't wait around for people to capture every single point source. And we already have too much CO2 in the air. And this is now widely perceived, but it wasn't. And so one can think happily, about when my research was mainly funded by the National Science Foundation, which, for all its faults, was much more bottom-up and much more responsive to clever ideas coming from the individual investigators and things like that, and much less likely to try and guess what's going to be successful. And I would go the next line into your next topic, Alex, and say that I tend to be a little bit of a libertarian in this way. I think that tax penalty and then some kind of payment to people who take out the garbage is better than trying to figure out which specific technologies to subsidize.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, I fall heavily in the camp of market-based solutions and, put a price on carbon and, create systems in which the market can respond. And we can argue all day about which systems and which structures and how do you put a price on carbon. But I firmly believe that if you do not have a price on carbon through a policy, there's no way to have those externalities be built into the system.
No question.
Okay, look, we've got to wrap this up, but this has been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to both of you for spending time with us. And also thanks to the audience for your participation and for your insightful questions. Again, there were hundreds of questions and we actually got through about 5 of them. Climate change is a massive crisis that impacts all of the world, of course. I don't think people realize just how bad it's going to get. And if you think dealing with the upheaval the next 50 years is 30 years is going to be tough, try living back in the Pliocene 3 million years ago, which is where we're heading. So there's plenty of great articles about that. If anybody wants to email me, I can forward them some information. In the meanwhile, The Earth Institute is here to try and help with this discussion and dialogue, and it's one of the best places in the world to actually discuss in a multidisciplinary way these problems of the future of the planet and what we need to take things forward. Please join us next month. We are very grateful for the fact we can carry on doing these things. It happens as a result of donations from people. So thank you for all your support, all of you who've been contributing. Next month, it's going to be myself with Lamont director Maureen Ramo, and we're going to be doing a special Earth lecture discussion around called Meeting the Moment, an Earth Month discussion. So look forward to that, and thanks all of you very much, and thanks again, Laurie and Peter. Massively appreciated what you just said. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.